The morning sun was already strong, casting long shadows across the quiet streets of a small town that seemed frozen in its old habits. The town was not large, but it carried with it an atmosphere of pride and isolation, the kind of place where people knew one another's families for generations. Outsiders were often noticed immediately, sometimes welcomed politely, but more often treated with suspicion. In the midst of this setting walked Maya, a young delivery girl with determination in her eyes and a cardboard box pressed against her chest. Maya had taken this job months ago not because it was easy, but because it was honest work. She liked the feeling of responsibility when she carried packages to people's doors, knowing she was helping someone's day become a little easier. She wore her uniform with pride, yellow polo shirt, black trousers, and a green cap that shielded her from the sun. Her sneakers had worn soles from miles of walking, but she never complained. Every step she took was a step toward building her future. That morning, Maya had left her small apartment early. She lived alone in a modest room, the kind of place where the paint peeled slightly near the window, but where she had pasted encouraging notes on the wall to remind herself why she worked so hard. "Keep going, Maya. You're stronger than yesterday," one note read in her neat handwriting. She carried that same spirit with her as she balanced the box in her arms and entered the town square. At first, people looked at her with blank expressions, some with faint curiosity, others with subtle disapproval. She noticed it, but she had learned to keep her eyes forward. Her work was her shield. She reminded herself that she was not here to make friends or win approval. She was here to deliver packages and to keep her dignity intact, but not everyone saw it that way. As Maya crossed the square, a loud sound broke the morning calm. The roar of a motorcycle engine echoed against the shop walls. Heads turned as Jake rolled in with his heavy bike, a machine almost as loud and arrogant as the man riding it. Jake was well known in town, not for kindness or respect, but for his temper and his need to dominate every space he entered. Wearing a sleeveless denim jacket, his muscular arms tattooed with bold ink, he carried himself like someone who thought he owned the streets. He noticed Maya immediately. The sight of her, a stranger in uniform carrying herself with quiet determination, seemed to ignite something in him. Maybe it was her confidence despite being an outsider. Maybe it was the way she did not look at him with the fear he was used to commanding. Whatever the reason, Jake slowed his bike, turned sharply, and parked it right in her path. Maya stopped, clutching the box tighter. She looked at him calmly, saying nothing. She had dealt with rude people before, but something about Jake's smirk told her this was different. "Well, well," Jake said loudly, making sure others nearby could hear. "Look what we've got here. Someone new, carrying boxes through my town. Who told you you could walk here?" His words were sharp, but Maya stayed silent. She shifted the weight of the box in her arms and prepared to step around him. Silence, she knew, was sometimes the most powerful answer. But Jake was not the kind of man who accepted being ignored. He stepped closer, his boots scraping the ground, his presence towering over her. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he growled, waving his hand in front of her face. "People like you don't belong here. This is my territory." Maya felt her heartbeat faster, but she kept her voice steady. "I'm here to do my job. Please let me pass." Jake laughed, a cruel sound that made a few onlookers chuckle nervously. He turned to his friends who had followed him and now stood behind, nodding and smirking like an audience eager for entertainment. "You hear that?" Jake said mockingly.
She thinks she can just pass.
"She thinks she can just walk through here like she owns the place." He leaned in closer and in a sudden, shocking move, he slapped the box in her arms. The package flew to the ground, landing with a dull thud. Dust rose from the street. The crowd gasped, and a few shopkeepers stepped forward as if to intervene but stopped, hesitant to challenge Jake directly. Maya froze for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. She looked at the box lying on the ground, the contents hopefully unbroken. Slowly she bent down, her fingers brushing away the dust, and lifted it back into her arms. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with something stronger than anger. It was not rage, it was resolve. Jake expected her to cry, to shout, or to leave, but she did none of those things. She simply looked at him straight into his eyes, her silence louder than any insult. That silence unsettled Jake more than he admitted. He had slapped away her dignity with the box, but somehow she had picked it back up, intact and unbroken. The murmurs of the crowd began to shift. They had seen Jake humiliate others before, but this was different. Maya's quiet strength was beginning to draw respect. For Maya, The slap was more than a physical insult. It was a reminder of all the times she had been told she was not enough. All the moments when people tried to push her aside because of her background, her skin, or her place in life. But she had never allowed anyone to define her worth. Not in the past and certainly not now. Jake raised his voice again, frustrated by her silence. "Did you not hear me? I said get out of my town." His words echoed across the square, but the crowd did not cheer for him this time. They watched Maya. Maya adjusted the box in her arms and replied softly, her voice steady and clear. "I came to deliver, that's all." Her words carried no threat, no anger, just truth. And truth has a power that arrogance cannot defeat. Jake clenched his fists, unsure of what to do next. He had expected to dominate the moment, to bask in laughter and fear. Instead, he felt the control slipping away, and it frightened him more than he wanted to admit. As Maya walked past him carrying the box once again with dignity, the crowd parted. Some looked at her with admiration, others with shame for not standing up sooner. Jake stood frozen, his pride bruised by a young woman who had refused to break. That morning, something shifted in the town. It was subtle but undeniable. People saw in Maya what true strength looked like. It was not loud, it was not violent, it was silent resilience, the kind that could not be slapped away. And though Jake did not know it yet, this was only the beginning of a lesson he would never forget. The sun had moved higher in the sky, and the town square seemed to hum with tension long after Maya had picked up her box and walked past Jake. People who had witnessed the scene could not stop whispering about it. Some shook their heads, embarrassed that none of them had stepped forward to defend her. Others felt stirred by the quiet bravery they had seen. Maya herself walked steadily down the street, her arms wrapped firmly around the package as if it carried not only goods but also the weight of her own pride. Her heart still beat faster than usual, but she did not let it show. She reminded herself that life had always placed challenges before her, and she had always found a way to keep moving forward. Growing up, she had faced moments when people tried to tell her she was not enough, too young, too poor, too different. Yet every time, she had reminded herself that her worth was not in their words but in her actions. Today was no different. Behind her, Jake was fuming. He had expected her to break down, to run, or at least to plead for mercy. Instead, she had given him nothing but silence and a steady gaze. To a man like Jake, silence was not weakness. It was a mirror that forced him to see himself clearly. And he did not like the reflection. He kicked at the dirt, his pride stinging sharper than any wound. His friends, who usually laughed at his cruelty, now stood uncomfortably, unsure of whether to cheer him on or distance themselves. The crowd's mood had shifted, and with it, so had their courage. Maya reached the door of a small shop where the package was meant to be delivered. The shopkeeper, an older woman with kind eyes, had watched the entire scene from her doorway. As Maya handed her the box, the woman placed a gentle hand on hers and whispered, "You are stronger than he will ever be." Those words were simple, but they warmed Maya's heart. For a moment she felt the strength of quiet allies who might not speak loudly in public, but who carried respect in their hearts. Jake, meanwhile, refused to let the moment end. He roared his motorcycle back to life, circling the square in frustration. The sound of the engine was deafening, but it could not drown out the whispers of the townspeople. He felt his control slipping, and the only way he knew to respond was with more noise, more aggression. He rode past Maya as she left the shop, cutting close enough that the wind from his bike pushed against her clothes. But still, she did not flinch. The more she ignored him, the more unsettled he became. "Why won't she break?" he muttered under his breath. For Jake, power had always been measured by fear. He thrived on watching others cower before him. Yet here was someone who refused to give him that satisfaction. Her calmness made him feel small, and that was a feeling he had never allowed himself to admit. As Maya walked toward her next stop, she remembered her mother's words once again. "When they shout, stay steady. When they strike, rise higher. Dignity is not something anyone can take unless you give it away." Those words had carried her through every challenge in her life. She smiled faintly, not because the situation was pleasant, but because she knew she was living out those lessons in real time. People on the street began to notice her differently now. Some nodded to her as she passed, others stepped aside with more respect than before. The story of what had happened in the square was already spreading. By the time she reached her next delivery, Whispers had turned into retellings. Did you see her stand against Jake? She didn't even raise her voice. She just stood there. Jake heard those whispers too, and each one felt like a thorn in his pride. He parked his bike and stormed into the bar where his friends often gathered. Slamming his hand on the counter, he demanded a drink. His friends tried to lighten the mood, but Jake's scowl silenced them. Deep inside, he knew the real fight was not with Maya, it was with himself. But he would never admit that aloud. Instead, he planned how to win back his reputation. Meanwhile, Maya continued her route. Every step she took was a reminder that courage was not about winning a fight with fists or words. It was about refusing to let others define who you were. She felt the box in her arms grow heavier with the heat of the day, but her spirit only grew lighter. She did not see herself as a hero. She was simply doing her job. Yet unknowingly, she was planting seeds of inspiration in the hearts of everyone who watched her. Later that afternoon, as she paused by a fountain to drink from her water bottle, a young boy approached her shyly. He had seen everything that morning and had run off to tell his friends. Now standing before her, he looked up with wide eyes. "Miss," he said softly, "you were really brave today." Nobody ever stands up to Jake. Maya bent down to his level and smiled. Sometimes being brave doesn't mean fighting. Sometimes it just means not giving in. The boy nodded, her words sinking deep into his young heart. Perhaps years later, when he faced his own challenges, he would remember the delivery girl who stood tall against the biker. As evening drew closer, Maya finished her last delivery. She was tired, her shoulders sore, but she felt proud of herself. She had not let Jake's cruelty define her day. She had faced humiliation and turned it into dignity. Walking home, she replayed the scene in her mind, not to dwell on the pain, but to remind herself of her strength. Back in the bar, Jake overheard more whispers about Maya. The more people talked, the more restless he became. He slammed his fist against the table, declaring, "This isn't over. She humiliated me, and I won't let her walk away like that." His friends exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen Jake angry before, but this was different. His pride had been shaken, and pride could be more dangerous than anger. The stage was set for another encounter, though neither Maya nor Jake yet knew how it would unfold. What was clear, however, was that the balance of power had already shifted. Jake's strength was loud but fragile, while Maya's strength was quiet yet unbreakable. The town had begun to see the difference, and in the days to come, they would witness a lesson neither Jake nor Maya would ever forget. That night, as Maya lay in her small apartment, she looked at the notes on her wall once more. Her eyes settled on one that read, "Your silence is not weakness, it is power." She closed her eyes with a faint smile, knowing she had proven that truth today, and though tomorrow promised more challenges, she was ready. Because courage, once awakened, does not easily go back to sleep. The following morning arrived with a strange stillness in the town. People carried on with their daily lives, opening shops, sweeping porches, arranging goods. But beneath the routine, conversations continued about what had happened the day before. Everywhere Maya went, she noticed quick glances and quiet murmurs. She did not consider herself extraordinary, yet the memory of her standing tall in the face of Jake's cruelty had become a story retold in every corner. For Maya, life had to continue as usual. She packed her bag with delivery slips, adjusted her cap, and prepared for another long day. She was determined not to let one man's actions dictate her path. Yet in her heart, she knew Jake was not the kind of person who would let things rest. She had seen the fury in his eyes when she refused to crumble. Still, she told herself, I cannot live in fear. If I do, then he wins twice. Meanwhile, Jake had spent a sleepless night. He tossed and turned, his pride wounded deeper than any physical injury. For years, he had ruled the streets with intimidation, and people had feared him enough to step aside. But Maya's refusal to bow had created cracks in that image. In the bar, his friends no longer laughed at his jokes with the same eagerness. In the square, townspeople who once moved aside quickly now met his gaze with faint defiance. And worst of all, he knew that every whisper of Maya's courage was also a whisper of his defeat. Jake woke determined to reclaim his power. He told himself that the only way to silence the story was to silence Maya. He oiled his bike, revved the engine, and planned to teach her a lesson that no one would forget. But pride has a way of blinding men, and Jake did not see that the lesson was not his to teach, it was his to learn. Maya began her route with steady steps, her arms full of packages. She smiled faintly at an elderly man who held the door open for her, and she exchanged polite greetings with a shopkeeper. To her surprise, people who once ignored her presence now treated her with small gestures of respect. A child waved at her from across the street. An old woman called out, "Stay strong, my dear." Their voices encouraged her, even if she did not fully understand how deeply her actions had touched them. By midday, as she crossed the square once again, the familiar roar of Jake's motorcycle filled the air. The sound turned heads, but this time the reaction was different. Instead of admiration, people braced themselves for trouble. Maya stopped, adjusting the box in her arms, and watched as Jake pulled up in front of her. His face was hard, his eyes narrowed with anger. "You think you embarrassed me yesterday," he said, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "But today you'll learn who really owns this place." Maya said nothing at first. She placed the box gently on the ground, not out of fear but to free her hands in case she needed them. Then she looked at Jake calmly. "I am here to work, not to fight. If you want respect, try giving it." Her words hit him harder than a physical blow. Jake clenched his jaw, trying to cover the sting of truth with more arrogance. He revved his engine, circling her in tight loops, the bike's tires spitting dust. The crowd gasped as he came dangerously close, but Maya stood still, her eyes fixed on him. Her silence and composure only fueled his fury. "Get out of my town," he shouted again, his voice cracking under the strain of anger. But even as he shouted, he noticed the faces around him. The people were not cheering him on. They were watching Maya. They admired her calm, her refusal to be shaken. For the first time, Jake felt the weight of the crowd's judgment pressing against him, and it made his hands tremble on the handlebars. In his desperation to prove himself, Jake leaned harder into the throttle, the bike roaring louder. He tried to intimidate her with sheer noise and speed. But pride often leads men to mistakes. As he turned sharply near her feet, the heavy machine tilted. The balance faltered. Before Jake could correct himself, the motorcycle leaned too far and gravity took over. With a deafening crash, the bike slammed to the ground, pinning Jake beneath its weight. Dust filled the air and the crowd gasped again, this time not in fear but in disbelief. The once dominant biker lay helpless, struggling to free himself from the very machine he had used to threaten others. His friends rushed forward but hesitated, unsure of how to lift the heavy bike without hurting him further. Maya stepped back, her face calm but firm. She did not laugh, she did not mock. She simply stood with dignity, her silence cutting deeper than any insult. The crowd now shifted their attention entirely. Jake, the man who had prided himself on control, lay trapped by his own arrogance, while Maya, the woman he tried to humiliate, stood tall and unbroken. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some shook their heads, saying softly, "That's justice." Others looked at Maya with newfound admiration. In that moment, respect changed direction. It no longer belonged to the biker, but to the delivery girl who carried herself with quiet strength. Jake's face burned with shame as his friends finally pulled the bike off him. He stumbled to his feet, his pride heavier than the machine that had pinned him. He expected Maya to gloat, to spit words of victory, but she did neither. She simply picked up her package from the ground, dusted it off, and said softly, "I came to deliver, not to fight." Those words echoed across the square. People nodded, repeating them quietly. Even children whispered them to one another, as if they were lines from a story that would be told for years. Jake could not escape them. They clung to him like chains, reminding him of the truth he had tried so hard to deny. Maya walked away, her steps steady, her dignity untouched. Behind her, the crowd began to disperse, but the atmosphere had changed. The townspeople no longer saw Jake as untouchable. Instead, they saw the fragility of arrogance and the strength of quiet courage. Jake stood there, his pride shattered, his body aching from the fall. For the first time, he questioned himself. He had always believed that power meant being feared, that respect could be taken by force. But Maya had shown him otherwise. She had not raised a hand against him, yet she had left him more defeated than any fight ever could. That night, as Maya returned home, she looked once more at the notes on her wall. Her eyes rested on a line she had written weeks before. "True strength is not in making others small, but in standing tall yourself." She realized she had lived those words fully today. She had shown the town and herself that courage is not about overpowering others, but about refusing to surrender your dignity, no matter the cost. And though Jake still nursed his wounded pride, a seed had been planted within him. A seed of humility, watered by the memory of lying helpless under his own bike while the woman he tried to crush walked away stronger than ever. That seed, though buried deep, would one day grow into change. For now, Maya rested knowing she had faced the storm and walked through it with her head held high. She was not a fighter, not a hero in the traditional sense, but she had proven that dignity itself is the greatest strength of all. The morning after Jake's fall, the town awoke with a new kind of energy. People carried baskets to the market, shopkeepers opened shutters, and children hurried along the cobblestone paths to school. But every conversation somehow circled back to the same event. The image of Jake pinned under his own bike, helpless and humiliated while Maya stood silently nearby, had spread far beyond the square. It was retold in barbershops, over breakfast tables, and whispered by young boys who practiced her calm words in the mirror. I came to deliver, not to fight. For Maya, life went on as usual. She rose early, tied her shoelaces carefully, straightened her uniform, and placed her delivery slips neatly in her bag. Her heart was steady. She did not see herself as a hero. She simply saw herself as a worker with a responsibility. But the town now saw her differently. The way people looked at her on the street carried more respect. A baker who once barely noticed her offered a fresh loaf of bread for free. An old man at the bus stop tipped his hat as she passed. It was not charity, it was recognition. Jake, however, had not slept well. He lay awake replaying the moment when his bike toppled, when the crowd's gasps turned into whispers that stripped him of his pride. He remembered Maya's calm eyes, her silence, and her words. No matter how hard he tried, he could not push them from his mind. His pride screamed at him to retaliate, to prove himself again, but another quieter voice, one he rarely listened to, kept asking, what if she was right? By midday, fate brought Maya and Jake back into the same square. Maya was delivering another package, her steps steady as always, when the sound of Jake's motorcycle roared once again. The crowd paused, unsure of what would happen this time. Some people crossed their arms, ready to step in if things escalated. Others leaned forward, curious. Jake parked his bike and stepped toward Maya. His friends hung back, their faces nervous. Everyone expected another confrontation, another storm of anger. But instead, Jake surprised them. He stood in front of her, his voice quieter than before. "Why didn't you laugh?" he asked suddenly. "Why didn't you say something when I was under the bike?" Maya looked at him, puzzled. What good would it do to laugh at someone already down? She replied softly. Her words disarmed him. He had prepared himself for defiance or insult, but not for kindness. He clenched his fists, unsure of how to respond. "You made me look weak," he muttered. "No," Maya said gently. "You made yourself look weak. I only chose not to add to it." The crowd shifted, whispering again. Jake felt the sting of truth pierce deeper. For years, he had believed that respect came from force. But now, in front of everyone, Maya's quiet dignity showed him that respect could not be taken. It had to be earned. Still, his pride resisted. He turned back to his bike and revved the engine, the sound echoing like a shield. But even as he tried to drown out the voices around him, he felt something shifting inside. Maya's words had planted themselves in his mind like seeds. He did not want them, yet they grew. Maya picked up her package again and prepared to continue her route. As she walked away, the crowd parted with admiration. No one remembered Jake's noise. They remembered Maya's calm, and Jake realized that day that silence could be louder than thunder. Later that evening, Jake sat alone by the riverbank where he often went to escape his own thoughts. The water flowed steadily, reflecting the orange glow of sunset. For the first time, he allowed himself to think beyond his anger. He remembered his younger days before arrogance had hardened him. He had once been kind, even hopeful. Life's hardships had twisted him into a man who thought cruelty was strength. But now Maya's strength had shown him what he had lost. In her small apartment across town, Maya prepared a simple dinner. She sat by the window, looking out at the stars. She thought of her mother again, remembering the lessons she had carried since childhood. She knew her actions had changed something in the town, but she also knew her journey was not finished. Life would always test her, but as long as she held on to her dignity, she would never lose herself. The following days brought subtle changes. People began standing up to Jake's friends when they tried to intimidate others. Shopkeepers who once stayed silent now spoke with more confidence. Children walked through the square with their heads held higher, inspired by the memory of the delivery girl who did not bow to fear. Jake noticed it too. His power, once unquestioned, was slipping away, not because Maya had fought him, but because she had revealed the truth about him. And truth has a way of spreading faster than fear. One afternoon, Jake saw Maya again, this time outside the post office. He approached her slowly, the crowd watching once more. But his voice was different, softer, almost hesitant. "You're stronger than me," he admitted, his eyes lowered. Maya shook her head. "No, I just chose a different kind of strength." He nodded, unsure of what to say. For the first time, he felt not humiliated but humbled. And though it would take time for him to change, a part of him knew that the woman he had once tried to crush had instead lifted a mirror to his soul. As days turned into weeks, the town carried the memory like a treasured story. Parents told their children about the day dignity defeated arrogance. Workers encouraged one another with Maya's words, and Maya herself continued her deliveries, her footsteps steady, her spirit unbroken. She did not seek fame or recognition. All she wanted was to do her job and live with honor. Yet unknowingly, she had become a symbol, not just for the town, but for anyone who had ever been told they were less than others. And Jake, once the feared biker, began to change in small ways. He greeted people with nods instead of scowls. He helped lift a cart when its wheel got stuck. He still wrestled with his pride, but he could no longer escape the truth. The strongest person he had ever met was the one he had once tried to humiliate. The town never forgot the day when the delivery girl stood tall. And Maya never forgot the lesson that had carried her through. True power lies not in how loudly you shout, but in how firmly you stand. That was the gift she carried. The gift she delivered without knowing. A gift more valuable than any package in her arms. The town had slowly begun to change. Days after the confrontation in the square, people no longer spoke about Jake with the same fear as before. His name, once whispered with unease, now carried something else: pity, disappointment, even quiet disapproval. It was as if the invisible chains he had used to control the town had been broken, and Maya had been the one who unknowingly held the key. Maya herself noticed the change, but tried not to let it distract her. She was not seeking to be a hero, nor did she crave the attention her actions had stirred. Her job still awaited her each morning, and her routine remained the same: lace up her worn sneakers, straighten her uniform, and head out with packages stacked neatly in her bag. Yet with every step she took, she carried with her a new kind of weight: the knowledge that people were watching. Not to judge her now, but to draw courage from her. One morning, as she crossed the same square where everything had happened, a shopkeeper stopped her. He was a quiet man, the type who rarely looked anyone in the eye, but now his gaze met hers with sincerity. "Miss," he said, his voice almost trembling, "the way you stood that day, it gave us all courage. I've run this shop for 30 years, and I've never spoken against Jake. But yesterday, when he shouted at a boy, I told him to stop. I would not have done it if I had not seen you stand the way you did." Maya nodded quietly, her heart touched. She smiled but said nothing more than, "I'm glad." She did not see herself as a leader, but she understood that small acts of courage often awaken courage in others. Jake, meanwhile, was living in the shadow of his own shame. He still rode his motorcycle, but it no longer drew admiration. When he passed through the streets, people no longer stepped aside in awe. They simply looked at him with cool indifference, some even with faint smirks. The respect he once commanded had slipped through his fingers. Every time he heard Maya's words replayed by the townspeople, "I came to deliver, not to fight," it felt like another blow to his pride. For days he avoided the square, choosing instead to ride outside town where no one could see him. Yet even there, by the riverbank or along the dusty roads, he could not escape his thoughts. He remembered the look in Maya's eyes, steady and unshaken, and it haunted him. He told himself she had humiliated him, but deep down he knew the truth. She had revealed him to himself. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange, Jake sat on the steps of the bar, staring at the ground. His friends tried to cheer him with jokes, but their laughter sounded empty. Finally, one of them said, "Jake, maybe she's not the enemy. Maybe you're just fighting yourself." The words stung, but Jake did not reply. He was not ready to face that truth aloud. Meanwhile, Maya's influence grew in unexpected ways. Children began to imitate her calm composure in their games. Neighbors who had once avoided one another now greeted each other warmly, united by the memory of how one woman's silence had shifted the entire balance of fear in their town. Even the elders, who often clung to old habits, admitted that something had changed in the air. But Maya remained grounded. In her small apartment, she still read the notes on her wall every night. One in particular seemed more real to her now. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to give in to it. She knew fear still existed in her heart, but she had learned to walk through it. One afternoon, as she was delivering to the far edge of town, she heard the familiar rumble of Jake's bike behind her. She turned, expecting the same arrogance, but what she saw was different. Jake stopped his motorcycle a few feet away, his shoulders slumped, his face tired. He removed his helmet, and for the first time, he looked less like the proud biker and more like a man carrying years of regret. "Why?" he asked suddenly. His voice cracked, raw and unguarded. "Why didn't you hate me after what I did? Why? Didn't you curse me like everyone else does?" Maya paused, then set the package in her arms gently on the ground. She looked at him not with anger, but with the same steady calm as before. "Because hate only adds more weight to the world," she said softly. "I already carry enough. I won't carry yours too." Jake stared at her, unable to respond. No one had ever spoken to him like that, with such simplicity and truth. He felt something break inside him, not his pride this time, but the wall he had built around his heart. The townspeople who witnessed this exchange felt a shift again, this time not in Maya, but in Jake. Some murmured that perhaps he was finally learning, others doubted he could ever change. But all agreed on one thing: Maya had reached a part of him no one else had dared to touch. That evening, Jake returned to the riverbank where he often sat alone. He replayed her words in his head, and for the first time he allowed himself to feel something other than anger. Shame, yes, but also a flicker of hope. Perhaps he could change. Perhaps it was not too late. Maya, on the other hand, continued her work without dwelling on him. She did not seek to change Jake, nor did she hold herself responsible for his choices. Her focus remained on her path, her dignity, and her resilience. She believed that everyone had to carry their own lessons, just as she carried her boxes each day. Some were heavy, some were light, but each one had to be delivered with care. As days turned into weeks, Jake began to act differently. He spoke less harshly to his friends. He even offered help to a farmer whose cart had broken down, lifting the wheel with his strong arms. People noticed, though they remained cautious. Change, they knew, was slow. But it was happening. The town itself felt lighter. Where fear had once cast a shadow, courage now created light. All because a young delivery girl had refused to bend under humiliation and instead stood tall with silence and dignity. And though Maya did not seek to be remembered, her story became part of the town's fabric. Children grew up hearing it as a lesson, that true power does not come from fists or loud voices, but from the unshakable strength of self-respect. Jake still wrestled with his pride, but each time he thought of her calm eyes, he found himself pausing before choosing cruelty. Slowly, almost against his will, he was learning. For Maya, every day remained a journey. She knew life would bring more challenges, more people who doubted her, more moments that tested her courage. But she also knew she carried within her the strength to face them. Not with violence, not with anger, but with the quiet power that had already changed a town, and perhaps even begun to change a man who once thought he was unbreakable. And so, she continued to walk the streets, her footsteps steady, her spirit strong, carrying packages that were far more than deliveries. They were reminders, to herself, to Jake, and to everyone who watched, that dignity once chosen can never truly be taken away. The town had lived under Jake's shadow for so long that people almost forgot what it felt like to breathe freely. Now, with each passing day, the air seemed clearer, lighter. Neighbors who once kept their heads down began to speak up, and children who used to scurry past Jake's gang now lingered in the square without fear. It was not that Jake had vanished. He still rode his motorcycle, still carried his presence, but something inside him had shifted, and the people felt it too. Maya noticed it during her daily routes. She would walk across the cobbled streets with her packages, and instead of tense silence, she heard warm greetings. "Good morning, Maya," someone would call. A child would run up and wave, his eyes wide with admiration. Shopkeepers who once watched nervously when Jake loomed now looked to Maya with gratitude. It humbled her. She had not sought to become a symbol. She only wanted to work honestly and hold on to her dignity. Yet life had a way of turning ordinary acts into extraordinary lessons. Jake wrestled with himself during those same days. He had lived years building an image of fear, and now it was cracking around him. At night, when the noise of the bar faded and the laughter of his friends disappeared into silence, he sat alone on his porch, staring at the stars. He replayed the words Maya had said to him by the roadside. "Hate only adds more weight to the world. I won't carry yours too." Those words haunted him, but not in the way he first thought. They lingered because they felt like truth. One evening, Jake tried to drown those thoughts with noise. He revved his motorcycle, speeding down the main road, the roar echoing through the town. He wanted to feel powerful again, to prove to himself that he was still the man he once was. But when he passed through the square, people did not scatter in fear. They simply stood, watching him, their eyes calm, unshaken. He saw no fear, no respect, only indifference. For the first time in his life, he realized that the sound of his engine no longer made him strong. It made him empty. Maya, at that same moment, was sitting in her room, writing on a piece of scrap paper she often used for notes. She wrote down a thought that had been resting in her heart all day. True change begins not when others see us differently, but when we see ourselves differently. She did not know why she wrote it, only that it felt important. She pinned it on her wall beside the others, a small reminder for the future. The next morning, Maya set out again. She carried a heavier package than usual, her shoulders straining, but her steps steady. As she reached the square, she saw Jake waiting. The crowd grew tense, unsure whether the biker had come to cause trouble or something else entirely. Maya stopped, her package resting in her arms, and waited silently. Jake walked toward her without his usual swagger. His bike was parked behind him, silent for once. His eyes, once sharp with arrogance, looked tired, searching. He stopped a few steps away and spoke in a low voice, though loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "I've done a lot of wrong," he said. The words seemed heavy, as if pulled out of him against his pride. "I thought fear was respect. I thought noise was strength. But when you stood there and said nothing, you showed me I was the weak one." The crowd stirred, whispers rising. Maya said nothing. She simply held his gaze, her silence inviting him to continue. Jake swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I can't keep living the way I was. You've shown me a different kind of strength, and I want to learn it." Gasps rippled through the onlookers. No one had ever heard Jake speak with humility. Some doubted his sincerity. Others felt a cautious hope. But all eyes turned to Maya, waiting to see what she would do. She did not smile, nor did she scold. She simply shifted the package in her arms and replied softly, "Change is not about words. It is about what you choose to do tomorrow." Her response was simple, but it struck deeper than any speech. Jake nodded slowly, understanding. He knew she would not hand him forgiveness like a gift. He would have to earn it not from her alone, but from the whole town he had once oppressed. From that day on, small signs of Jake's change began to appear. At first, people thought it was an act. He helped an elderly man lift a heavy sack of grain. He apologized to a shopkeeper he had once bullied. He began showing up at the mechanic's shop, offering to fix broken bicycles for children without charging them. Each act was small, almost quiet, but they added up. The town watched carefully. Some forgave quickly, others held back, their wounds too fresh. But even the most skeptical could not deny that Jake was trying. And while his journey was far from complete, The fact that he was willing to try it all was something no one had expected. Maya continued her deliveries, unchanged on the outside but with a growing sense of peace inside. She had not planned to change Jake. She had only stood her ground, protecting her dignity. Yet in doing so, she had not only changed the course of her own life, but also shifted the path of a man who once believed cruelty was strength. One evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold, Jake approached Maya again. This time there was no crowd, no noise, just the two of them by the fountain in the quiet square. He spoke softly. "I used to think being feared was enough, but when I saw the way people looked at you, I realized something. They respected you without you asking for it. They admired you without you demanding it. I don't know if I can ever be like that, but I want to try." Maya looked at him for a long moment. "Then start small," she said. "Respect others. Respect yourself. The rest will follow." He nodded, the words settling into him like seeds once again. That night, Jake rode his motorcycle slower than usual. For the first time, he didn't ride to make noise. He rode to feel the wind against his face, to remind himself that he was still alive, still capable of change. He thought of Maya's calm eyes, her steady words, and the dignity she carried like armor. He realized he did not need to become her. He only needed to become a better version of himself. In her room, Maya looked at her wall of notes and added another line. "The loudest lesson is taught in silence." She smiled faintly, knowing that life had a way of teaching even those who resisted the hardest. The town continued to change with them. Neighbors helped one another more freely. Children grew up with new stories of courage. And Maya remained at the heart of it. Not because she sought to lead, but because she chose every day to carry herself with dignity. Jake's transformation was not immediate, nor was it perfect. He stumbled, he fought against his old habits, but he no longer fought against the truth. And every time he felt himself slipping back into pride, he remembered the weight of his own motorcycle pinning him to the ground, and Maya standing tall beside him, silent but stronger than any voice he had ever known. That memory became his compass, guiding him slowly toward the man he wanted to be. And so, the town witnessed not just one act of courage, but the ripple effect of it. They saw how one delivery girl's quiet strength had sparked change not only in their streets, but in the heart of the very man who once made them afraid. The weeks turned into months, and the town began to feel like a different place. Where fear had once lingered like a shadow, there was now a sense of freedom. People walked the streets without glancing over their shoulders. Children played more openly, and shopkeepers conducted their business without the unease that Jake's presence used to bring. And at the center of this transformation was a delivery girl who never sought recognition, but whose courage had reshaped the lives of many. Maya still rose early each morning, tied her sneakers, and began her route with quiet determination. She carried her packages the same way as always, but now people stopped her along the way to greet her warmly or offer her a drink of water. It embarrassed her sometimes. She did not want to be treated as if she were extraordinary. To her, she had only done what was right, standing tall when someone tried to take away her dignity. Yet she understood that for others, her actions had been more than a moment. They had been a spark. Jake's journey, however, was slower, harder. He had lived so many years in arrogance that learning humility felt like learning to walk again. At first, the townspeople doubted his change. They remembered his cruelty too clearly to believe in his words. But over time, his actions began to speak for him. He helped repair fences, carried heavy sacks for the elderly, and stopped his friends when they tried to mock someone. He was not perfect. There were days when his temper flared, when his old habits tried to resurface. But each time he caught himself, remembering the look in Maya's eyes and the way silence had defeated his noise. Maya noticed the changes too. She saw him greet people instead of sneering, saw him ride his motorcycle without the same arrogance. Once, as she crossed the square, she noticed Jake helping a young boy fix his broken bicycle chain. The boy laughed with joy when the wheel spun freely again, and Jake smiled, a small, genuine smile that carried no pride, only relief. It was in that moment Maya realized that people could change, if only they were willing to face themselves. But change was not only in Jake. The entire town seemed to shift its rhythm. Neighbors began helping one another more openly. The stories of fear were replaced by stories of courage. The words Maya had spoken, "I came to deliver, not to fight," had become almost like a proverb repeated among the people. Parents reminded their children of it when they faced bullies. Friends repeated it to one another in moments of hardship. It became part of the town's heartbeat. One evening, the town gathered for a small festival, something they had not done in years. Lanterns lit the streets, music filled the air, and laughter rose like a song. Maya attended quietly, carrying no packages for once, only the comfort of being part of the community. She stood at the edge of the square, watching families dance when she noticed Jake approaching. He did not come with noise or swagger, but with quiet steps, his hands clasped nervously behind his back. He stopped a few feet from her and said softly, "I owe you something." Maya tilted her head. "You don't owe me anything." Jake shook his head firmly. "I owe you more than you know. You didn't fight me when I tried to crush you. You didn't curse me when I fell. You gave me the one thing no one else ever did, a chance to see myself. That's worth more than I can repay." Maya looked at him for a long moment, then answered, "If you really believe that, then keep proving it, not to me but to yourself and to them." She gestured toward the townspeople laughing and dancing under the lanterns. Jake followed her gaze, his eyes softening. "I'll try," he said quietly, and that was enough. The night continued with music and laughter, and for the first time in years the square felt free of fear. People danced without looking over their shoulders, and children ran in circles with joy. Maya smiled faintly, knowing that this was not her doing alone, but the result of everyone choosing courage over silence. Still, she carried pride in her heart. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that whispers. You stood tall when it mattered. Later, as she walked home under the glow of lanterns fading into the night, Maya thought of her mother again. She remembered the lessons written on scraps of paper and pinned to her wall. Dignity cannot be taken unless you give it away. Courage is not in fists, but in standing tall. The loudest lesson is taught in silence. She realized she had not only lived those lessons, but she had delivered them, without ever planning to, just as faithfully as she delivered her packages each day. Jake, too, returned home that night a different man. He still carried his mistakes, still felt the weight of the harm he had done. But he also carried hope now, the hope that tomorrow he could choose differently. He had learned painfully and slowly that true strength was not in making others small, but in lifting himself higher without pushing others down. The story of that year lived on in the town for generations. Parents told their children about the day a biker slapped a delivery girl, and how she stood tall, silent but unbroken. They told how his arrogance trapped him under his own bike, and how her dignity freed not only herself but the entire town from fear. It became more than a story. It became a lesson etched into their identity, and Maya, she continued her simple life. She delivered packages every morning, smiled at neighbors, and wrote new notes on her wall. She did not see herself as a legend. She saw herself as a worker, a daughter, a woman who had chosen dignity when it was hardest to hold. And perhaps that was what made her story so powerful. She was ordinary, yet in her ordinariness, she revealed the extraordinary strength that lives quietly within us all. In the end, the biker who once brought fear learned humility. The town that once lived in silence learned courage. And the delivery girl who only wanted to do her job left behind something greater than any package. She left a legacy of respect. And so, the story closed not with a fight, not with revenge, but with transformation. Proof that dignity, once chosen, can change not just a person but a place, a people, and even the very meaning of strength itself.